In this video, we're going to be talking about William Paley's teleological argument. This is also known as the argument from design. Here's William. He was born in 1743 and he died in 1805. So, to compare this to the times that the other figures that we've looked at lived, St. Anselm was born in 1033 and died in 1109. St. Anselm gave us the ontological argument. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 and died in 1274. He's the one who gave us the cosmological argument. And William Paley was born in 1743 and died in 1805. And as we'll see, he's going to give us something called the teleological argument. William Paley was an Anglican clergyman born in Peterborough, England, and he was educated at Christ's College, Cambridge, and became a fellow there in 1777. The book we're looking at is called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, collected from the appearances of nature, and it was first published in 1802, just before Paley died. This was actually the last book that he worked on. And in this book, Paley laid out a full exposition of natural theology, the belief that the nature of God could be understood by reference to his creation, the natural world. Now, we may wonder, what does teleological mean? Well, teleology is the explanation of phenomenon in terms of the way they're designed or the purpose that they serve. So, the argument that we're going to see today is an argument for the existence of God that comes from the evidence of order in nature. The argument claims to show that following from this order, there must have been something that designed or intentionally created this order, and that this designer is God. This argument is also known, following from this, as the design argument or the argument from design. Paley develops his version of the argument using an analogy between a watch and the world. Now we'll take a look at this argument, starting at the beginning of our reading. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. So, what's going on here? Well, Paley is walking across the heath, right, which is like a big field, and he bumps his foot against a stone. And when he does, he asks himself, how long has the stone been here? And it seems like it's a perfectly natural answer to say, it's been there forever. All right. But suppose I'd found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. So, what's going on here? Well, Paley's pointing out that, I'd previously just been walking and kicked a stone and asked how I might answer if I'd asked how long the stone had been there, forever. But if I came across a watch laying in the middle of a field, would I have the same answer, that the watch had always been there? Yet, why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? So, why is it not the same with the watch as with the stone? Why is it when I come across the stone in the field, I have one answer for how long it's been there that seems acceptable, and for the watch, I have a different answer? Why is that? What's going on? Well, for this reason and for no other. That is, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. For example, that they're so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered to the use that it is served by it now. So we see that what Paley's answer is that the difference between the stone and the watch is that it seems like the watch was put together to accomplish a particular thing. So Paley follows this up with a very long, detailed explanation of the inner workings of a watch, just to really bring home the point he's trying to make. Then he follows it up with this. This mechanism being observed, it requires indeed an examination of the instrument and perhaps some previous knowledge of the subject to perceive and understand it. But being once, as we have said, observed and understood, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehend its construction and designed its use. All right, so we can see here that Paley is claiming that, look, if a watch was built to serve this function, there must be a person that built it. If it was designed, it must have a designer. All right. Now, our reading is going to jump ahead a little bit in Paley's writing. It's going to jump to the very end of chapter 2. And at the very end of chapter 2, we come across something that might be a little bit confusing to us. And that is, or shall it, instead of this, all at once turn us round to an opposite conclusion, namely that no art or skill would ever have been concerned in the business, although all other evidences of art and skill remain as they were, and this last and supreme piece of art be now added to the rest. Can this be maintained without absurdity? And yet, this is atheism. So what Paley is doing here is to claim that if we believe that the watch could exist without a watchmaker, that is as absurd as believing that the world couldn't exist without someone making or designing it. God, of course. However, this absurdity, right, like imagining that the watch existed without the watchmaker, is exactly what an atheist is doing. All right. Now we're going to jump ahead to chapter 5. Every observation which was made in our first chapter concerning the watch may be repeated with strict propriety concerning the eye, concerning animals, concerning plants, concerning, indeed, all organized parts of the works of nature. So, Paley here draws out that if the watch must have a designer, then so should the eye, animals, plants, and indeed all the organized parts of the works of nature. All right, now that we've gone through all of this, we have what we need to put together our argument. We're going to call this the Teleological Argument, the Analogy version. Premise 1. A watch is very complex, so it couldn't exist without a watchmaker who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Premise 2. Our world and everything in it is even more complex than a watch. Premise 3. So, the world must also have a maker who comprehended its construction and designed its use. And of course, our conclusion, this maker is God. Awesome. There we go. This is our first version of Paley's teleological argument drawn from his text. In the next part of the reading, Paley considers a few possible objections to what he's put forward. If we read the full reading, he does this in excruciating detail in a few different ways. But I've trimmed it down quite a bit to make it a little bit more straightforward. I have, however, linked the reading if you want to read the full version and have the opportunity to look at the detail that Paley puts into this reading. But now we'll consider the first of a few possible objections. So here we go. Objection 1. When we're inquiring simply after the existence of an intelligent creator, imperfection, inaccuracy, liability to disorder, occasional irregularities may subsist in a considerable degree without introducing any doubt into the question. Just as a watch may frequently go wrong, seldom perhaps exactly right, may be faulty in some parts, defective in some, without the smallest ground of suspicion, from thence arising that it was not a watch or not made for the purpose ascribed to it. We're going to call this the imperfection objection. So, some people might object to Paley's argument that imperfections, inaccuracies, liability to disorder, and occasional irregularities exist in the world. So how could the world have been created by an intelligent designer given these problems? Paley responds that imperfections, inaccuracies, liabilities to disorder, and occasional irregularities can exist to a considerable degree without bringing the existence of an intelligent designer into doubt. Just as a watch may frequently go wrong, seldom perhaps exactly right, may be faulty in some parts, defective in some, without the smallest ground of suspicion, from thence arising that it was not a watch or not made for the purpose ascribed to it. All right, let's move on to the second objection. There may be also parts of plants and animals, as there were supposed to be of the watch, of which in some instances the operation, in others the use, is unknown. These form different cases. For the operation may be unknown, yet the use be certain. Thus it is with the lungs of animals. It does not, I think, appear that we are acquainted with the action of the air upon the blood, or in what manner that action is communicated by the lungs. Yet we find that a very short suspension of their office destroys the life of the animal. In this case, therefore, we may be said to know the use, nay, we experience the necessity of the organ, though we be ignorant of its operation. We're going to call this the unknown operation objection. So, some people might object that our world and the things in it can't be designed because there are things that we don't understand the operation or use of. So here, Paley points out that although in his time we didn't know how the lungs operated, we do know that they're necessary, right? He points this out when he says that basically if we stop the breathing of an animal, the animal dies, which lets us know that breathing is obviously necessary for it to survive. But just because we don't always know how something works doesn't mean that it isn't necessary, and things can still be the work of an intelligent designer even if we don't understand how every part of that thing works. All right, let's look at the third objection. This is always to be computed when the question is whether a useful or imitative confirmation be the product of chance or not. I desire no greater certainty in reasoning than by which chance is excluded from the present disposition of the natural world. Universal experience is against it. What does chance ever do for us? In the human body, for instance, chance, that is, the operation of causes without design, may produce a win, a wart, a mole, a pimple, but never an eye. Among inanimate substances, a clod, a pebble, a liquid drop might be, but never was a watch, a telescope, an organized body of any kind, answering a valuable purpose by a complicated mechanism, the effect of chance. In no assignable instance has such a thing existed without intention somewhere. We're going to call this the why not chance objection. So some people might object that it's possible that every part of our world came to be as it is following from chance. But Paley claims that universal experience is against this objection, which is to say that our experience is inconsistent with the idea that every part of our world could have been created by chance. At least that's how the objection is supposed to go. So chance may be able to create a wart or a mole or a pimple, but chance could never create an eye, according to Paley. Among inanimate substances, a clod, a pebble, or a liquid drop might be created by chance, but never was a watch, a telescope, or an organized body of any kind. Now that we've got this idea that chance can't be responsible for the formation of the world, we have the resources to draw out a second teleological argument from Paley's writing. We'll call this version the non-analogy version. So it begins with premise 1. There are two possible explanations for how the world, or a given part of it, for example the human eye, came to be as it is. One is chance, and the other is design. As we just saw, according to Paley, it couldn't be chance, so it must be design. And this implies a designer. And of course, this designer must be God. Okay, so I think that this is sort of the classic formulation of the teleological argument. And we can see an objection might jump out at us. Okay, so how this type of argument works is that when you give your options, you move the argument forward by giving reasons why some number of the options won't work, and then you're left with only one option. Okay? However, if we add another option to the argument, for example, evolution, then, following the form of the argument, we have to show why not only chance won't work, but evolution. So if we imagine the argument in this formation, it would say, there are three possible explanations for how the world, or a given part of it, for example the human eye, came to be as it is. One is chance, the other is design, and the third is evolution. Now, if the argument is going to follow this form, it has to say it couldn't be chance, and then it would also have to say that it couldn't be evolution in order to arrive at the premise that it must be design, and for this to imply a designer. And I think that it's following from the considerations of this argument that we find ourselves in the place that we are today, where people think that it's necessary to argue against evolution in order to believe that God exists. If I could transmit anything, I would hope that we looked at many arguments that do not require us to not believe in evolution, that give us the conclusion that many of us might want, that God exists. Now, we're also going to look at a third version of the teleological argument when we look at Russell's objections in the next assignment. I'm going to call this the fine-tuning version. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through the premises, and we'll talk about this version of the argument in more depth when we get to that assignment. but I just want to implant it in your brain right now. Premise 1. Everything in the world is made just so that we can manage to live in the world. Premise 2. If the world was ever so little different, we could not manage to live in it. Premise 3. The most likely explanation for these conditions is that a powerful and vastly intelligent designer created them. Of course, this designer is God. All right, to bring it all together, the argument for the existence of God that we looked at comes from carefully considering the order of nature and the cause of this order. The teleological argument claims to show that following from this order, there must have been something that designed or intentionally created the order, and that this designer is God. This argument is also known as the design argument, or the argument from design. We looked at 3 different versions of the teleological argument. 2 were drawn directly from Paley's writing, and the third, which we're going to consider more in depth in our next assignment.